better have some Metroid Prime 4 information in April, Nintendo. Anyway, good evening, folks. So, yeah, I got a Metroid on the brain, so welcome to another edition of Industry Influences, a series where you take a look at a major pillar of the video game industry and talk about the overall influence that it's had on the industry moving forward. And today we're looking at one of my favorite video game franchises of all time, and that is Metroid. Metroid has always been a very interesting series for me in regards to how it's influenced the video game industry moving forward. Mostly because, despite the fact that Metroid rarely, if ever, reaches blockbuster status with a lot of its releases, the series is still extremely influential in a lot of respects, and yeah, it's proof positive that even if your game isn't successful at launch, if it's as good as you know it is, people are still going to play it several years later. And yeah, there are a lot of really good games in the Metroid series. And of course, it's had a greater impact on a variety of different franchises as well. So before we get into how Metroid has shaped the industry, let's talk about how the series actually came to be. So the original Metroid was made in '87, I want to say. Around that time, the two biggest franchises on the video game industry were the Super Mario Bros. Series and The Legend of Zelda. Mario was famous for its fluid gameplay, its fast-paced, smooth controls, and its cartoony visuals. And Zelda was well known for its open-ended gameplay, its sprawling adventure world, and its fantasy setting. So R&D 1, which is one of Nintendo's oldest development houses, wanted to add to the catalog of games by trying to combine these two together. So what they came up with was having the 2D gameplay of The Legend of Zelda, but not the 2D gameplay of Mario, but combined with the exploration-heavy gameplay of Mario. The Zelda. And wanting to set it apart from Mario and Zelda, they decided to go with a sci-fi setting too, taking inspiration from Ridley Scott's Alien and, just kind of going from there. In regards to the title, a lot of the levels in the game appear to be tunnels, and one of the programmers said that it felt like they were going through the metro, and everyone thought that Samus appeared to be some kind of android, so that's where you get Metroid. However, when Metroid was originally released, it actually didn't do terribly well, and that's primarily because the original version of Metroid was released on the Famicom Disk System, an add-on which was popular initially, but by the time Metroid came out, it had unfortunately become very unpopular, and sales took a hit as a result, despite the fact that Metroid received widespread critical acclaim upon its release. If it wasn't for the fact that Metroid would do much, much better in the United States, odds are the series wouldn't be going strong today. But yeah, Metroid would be able to shoulder on as well, mostly through the efforts of various studios, like, of course, R&D 1 continuing to support the series, sometimes against Nintendo's wishes, as a matter of fact, and Retro Studios, who really did give it a shot in the arm that led to Metroid's most prolific era in the early 2000s. But anyway, what kind of effect has Metroid had on the gaming industry? Well, first off, in the realm of sci-fi, I feel like Metroid's influence is highly understated. When it comes to sci-fi, I find there are usually three kinds of slants that come with it. You got something like Star Trek, that hyper clean, super futuristic style of space travel. Then you got something like Star Wars, which is more of a space western style. And I'm struggling to think of an example, but other space series, something like Doom, where there's a lot more mysticism involved in it, it seems. But Metroid, in a lot of ways, was one of the first to really combine all these elements together, while also throwing in, the sci-fi horror aspect of aliens. And because of that, it would sort of create its own unique vibe in regards to sci-fi. And I could think of a couple of franchises that definitely do take influence from Metroid in that respect. The obvious one that comes to mind is the Halo series. Now, Metroid and Halo are two very different games. They're not even in the same genre. But it's kind of hard not to look at Master Chief and not make the connection between him and Samus. And some of the enemies they fight, the Covenant, I feel like there is some influence from the Space Pirates in there. The Flood with the Metroids, all that stuff. You can definitely tell that the people at Bungie's were big fans of Metroid back in the day, but they were also smart enough to take influence from other sci-fi stories too. So while that influence is definitely there, that's not the main driving force of, Halo. There are plenty of other sci-fi franchises that it took influence from, which is why it feels so fresh, despite, being very cliche. Another series that, sort of gets that Metroid vibe across, I would say, is Guardians of the Galaxy. Again, a lot of people might say that's a stretch, but I just kind of look at some of the set pieces in this movie, and I can't help but tie it into a lot of what you see in the Metroid series. And again, Metroid is a series that is heavily inspired by, a lot of sci-fi series like Aliens, which Guardians of the Galaxy has also taken influence from. But Guardians of the Galaxy really is, similar to Metroid in that world. Like, this is the kind of sci-fi setting that I always imagined Samus would be operating in on a daily basis, as opposed to, something like Star Wars or Star Trek. So, yeah, I'd say that influence is there, though it's not as prominent as other franchises I can think of. You can definitely make the argument that Alien, Star Wars, and Star Trek are more instrumental in the development of the sci-fi series. I would say that the influence in Metroid is there in a lot of respects. Another area where I would say that Metroid was a big influence was in regards to its main character, Samus Aran. Though she wasn't the first female protagonist in gaming, it was really shocking for players to get to the end of the original Metroid and to discover that Samus was in fact a woman. And that's always the reaction people get when they are introduced to Samus for the first time. I remember when I was introduced to the character for the first time in Super Smash Bros. I saw Samus in there, and my first inclination was to think it was a robot, and I always referred to the character as a he. But then my brothers started reading off the trophy information Melee, and I was confused as to why he was referring to this character as she. And then later on, I dove more into the Metroid series and found that, holy crap, that's a woman under there. And that was always really cool to see. And yeah, even today, Samus is still one of the most famous female protagonists in any video game, period. She's definitely had her low points, stuff like Metroid Other M. In fact, I can't really say that they've gotten her character down pat just yet. They still need to work on that for sure. But yeah, one of the earliest examples of a female protagonist in video games. And while people are always going to say that female protagonists aren't as prominent in gaming, or that when they are in a game that are sexualized, and yeah, they do sexualize Samus a lot in these games. Like, the first image I showed here was Samus in her space bikini. But, 99.9% of the game is Samus in the suit, and honestly, that's typically what I think of when I think of seeing her. So, yeah, I wouldn't say that she's sexualized to a negative degree. They just think it's cool that underneath this spacesuit is this just beautiful woman. So, yeah, I always thought that was really cool, and a lot of people agree. And of course, that would pave the way for other female protagonists in gaming. Characters like Lara Croft, Bayonetta, just plenty of characters. So, yeah, we definitely have Samus to thank for that. She probably wasn't the first female protagonist in any game, but she was the one that, said, hey, I can do anything Link or Mario can, so yeah. But of course, Metroid's biggest contribution to the video game industry is, of course, in the fact that, in essence, it invented a genre, the Metroidvania series. And I know that a lot of people refer to this genre these days as search action. No, it's Metroidvania. It's always going to be Metroidvania. Don't even bother with that noise. But anyway, what is a Metroidvania? Well, a Metroidvania is essentially a 2D side-scroller where progression isn't necessarily about getting from point A to point B, but instead having a lot of different branching paths that will lead you to different parts of the map. So the idea is you go down one map, you find a dead end, so you go back the way you came, go down another path, and you find an upgrade. For example, you'll find the Morph Ball, and because you have that Morph Ball, you can now slip through a tiny gap in that first path you went down, and now more of the map has just opened up. Some major tenets of the Metroidvania genre are just an ever-expanding arsenal of abilities, the feeling of constantly growing stronger, lots of varied bosses, and a pretty good deal of freedom too. And all of this was first brought to the forefront in the original Metroid. Now, that's not to say that the original Metroid was necessarily perfect. There were some issues with the game. I would say the biggest thing that the original game is missing is, just a simple map screen. But Nintendo would eventually perfect the Metroidvania genre with Super Metroid, which to this day is still considered one of the single most refined 2D platformers of all time, and for good reason. It's still a really good game. And it would be further perfected a couple years later with another franchise, Castlevania, specifically Symphony of the Night. Before Symphony of the Night, Castlevania was more of a linear action game series, but when Rondo of Blood came out, they started to get away from that. They started having a bunch of different branching paths that would take you to alternate levels, and for the next game in the series, Symphony of the Night, they decided to go all in on that and make a completely non-linear action game. And Lord and behold, they essentially just turned Castlevania into Metroid, just, with a Castlevania theme. Not that that's a bad thing. Symphony of the Night was and still is a amazing game by all accounts, and that's why the genre has the name it does. Metroid invented it, but Castlevania perfected it. Henceforth, Metroidvania. And this is still one of the most popular game genres in the entire industry, especially in the indie scene. The Metroidvania genre has become especially popular. Famous titles include stuff like Guacamelee, Cave Story, Dust and Elysian Tale, Hollow Knight. It's still a very prominent genre to this day, and it seems like it's only getting better and better. It's also a good example of 2D games still surviving all these years, despite the fact that 3D gaming has become very prominent. Speaking of 3D, Metroid is still innovating in regards to the Metroidvania genre as well. Mostly in the fact that it's still one of the few franchises to really do the genre properly in the third dimension. Metroid Prime, for example, to me is still the pinnacle of a 3D Metroidvania, just taking all those elements that make up a Metroidvania and just applying it to a 3D space. while we do get a little bit of direction in the game, you're still mostly expected to figure things out on your own, which is the problem that I feel a lot of other 3D Metroidvanias fall into. While there are definitely hints of that in stuff like Jedi Fallen Order and the rebooted Tomb Raider series, you're just given so much direction in those games to the point where, you know, it's kind of hard to get lost in those games. Very rarely are you ever given complete freedom to just explore the maps, which I wish more games would do. But I do understand also wanting to focus on narrative as well, which is something that even Metroid itself is guilty of as well. While Metroid Prime, to me, is still the pinnacle of the 3D Metroidvania game, games like Metroid Prime 2 and Metroid Prime 3, definitely took it in a different direction, especially Metroid Prime 3, which may have made things just a little too linear for its own good. But, still really good games, so I can't really complain too much. But yeah, as you can see, Metroid really has had a profound impact on the industry moving forward. Now, that's not to say that it's the most influential franchise out there. Again, you could make the argument that other games in the industry have influenced things more than Metroid has, but it's still there, and just the simple fact that Samus has remained an icon all these years, despite not being the most successful franchise all these years, it really does speak volumes about how good this franchise is. And as always, I'm excited to showcase some of the games here on the channel, so be sure to tune in tomorrow as we dig into Metroid 2, The Return of Samus. We'll see you guys then.